Hi everyone, welcome to today's Pulse Roundtable. It's an introduction to the monthly theme of religion and human rights, and it's a chance to hear from the perspectives of the next generation of human rights defenders. I'm joined today by my fellow Pulse community members who have an interest in this area and have contributed articles touching on the themes, which we will be touching on a bit more later. So let's start by a round of introductions. I am Ploy and I'm a correspondent and contributor at Human Rights Pulse and host for this session.
Hi, my name is Samuel Pitchford. I'm an editor and a contributor, and I also covered the Uyghur Tribunal, which was last month.
Hi, I'm Leah. I'm a contributing writer at Human Rights Pulse as well.
Hi, I'm Yumna and I'm an editor at Human Rights Pulse.
Perfect, great. Thanks everyone for joining us this morning. I think it would be a useful start if we explore what religion and human rights mean and what their relationship is. So for me, it's a human right which is protected under Article 9 of the European Convention on Human Rights, and for those in the UK, under the Human Rights Act. It protects people's rights to freedom of thought, belief, and religion, which means you have a right to hold those beliefs as well as manifesting them so as to put those beliefs into action. So that can be seen through wearing religious clothing, talking about your beliefs or not talking about it if you don't want to, and taking part in religious worship. It also includes the right to change your religion or beliefs at any time, which can evolve as life goes on based on your experiences or perhaps what's happening in the current climate. And for me, really demonstrates the flexibility with this right to religious beliefs. It can only be restricted if the action is lawful, necessary, and proportionate to protect public safety, public order, health or morals, or rights and freedoms of other people. And for me, the right to religion is interesting because it's always evolving and extending. And when I was doing some research, it was saying that, it's extending to protect non-religious beliefs like atheism, agnosticism, even veganism, which I don't know how far it extends to, but it's quite, an interesting thought. But, there are many other ways that religion engages with our human rights outside, black letter law. So opening the floor to everyone else, what does religion and human rights mean to you?
I can kick off with a few thoughts on that. Totally the same. I fully believe religion is a human right. I think it's interesting with religion because historically it's played such a massive part in sort of shaping and defining society. Church and state have not always been separated, in some cases still aren't. And I think almost because of this, certain religions can be viewed as almost superlative in comparison with others. For an example, if one country has 90% of its citizens with one religion, like that's very much how that society is defined. It's made in the image and power of that, and then in some cases it can be used to dictate and subvert people practicing other religions. So that's a real shame. And I suppose just by way of introduction, I think there's a historical nexus, and that has contributed to sort of a politicization of religion and the power of religion in today's society. And then that can just be mixed with, a lot of ignorance about other religions, xenophobia. I suppose in some it's a human right, but ironically, it has the capacity to almost be like a tool of human rights abuse against other religions. And that's just sort of how it's developing.
I think so. I wrote an article for Human Rights Pulse that almost took on the same line as the point that Leah just made, but on a more intimate level. So sort of person to person or person to religious institution scale. So I had a look at spiritual abuse, and how Article 9 could potentially play a role in the validation and defense of the victims of spiritual abuse. Because as I myself carried out more research, I realized just how much this concept spreads across multiple religions, jurisdictions, demographics, but I had a look at its effect on women specifically. And it was chilling to note just how many instances of spiritual abuse mirrored each other despite their differences externally. So yeah, taking a look at Article 9 on the individual level was really interesting.
Yeah, to round off there, taking a sort of different approach, the articles I covered when I was covering the Uyghur Tribunal was looking at the suppression of religious freedom, which, and I would say religion and human rights is possibly the most important at the minute because it's the one that's being most egregiously violated. We have the Uyghur genocide, the Yazidi genocide, the genocide of the Hmong people, all of those based on the state authorities being against the religious practicings of a particular group and trying to, violently suppress them or de-religionize them. So I think that's why we possibly don't pay as much attention to that as much as we might have done 10, 15 years ago because of this, as Leah said, politicization of religion, which means people take political views on suppression of religion as opposed to looking at it just as an isolated thing and is someone's human rights being abused.
Great, yeah, thanks, Sam. And just picking up on that, I think you're right as well with Leah, what you were saying about how there's such a long history of religion, rights, politics, all of these things that we kind of think, oh, well, yeah, everyone has the right to believe in whatever religion or practice what religion they want. But actually, when you sit down and think about it, there's still so many abuses happening every day, and in 2021, I mean, the world's not perfect, but we need to sort of take the lessons from before and actually identify and stop and intervene and say, well, no, this shouldn't be happening. Let's do something about it. And just having this roundtable already with this introduction, it's already apparent to me, yes, religion and human rights, but there's so many different, strands of what is it and what that means for human beings living in this world. So yeah, so I don't know who wants to go first, but I really want to understand a bit more about your articles. Any volunteers? Otherwise I'll pick. Okay, I'm gonna pick. Right, Leah, can you tell us a bit more about your article on the burqa hijab bans, please?
Yeah, so I wrote an article, as we said, on so I wrote it just after Switzerland had voted in a referendum to ban face coverings, but it was very much marketed as a burqa ban. And I just wrote about how, it's centered on this stigmatization of Muslims, particularly Muslim women. It was portrayed as a ban of face coverings, in a year where literally everyone was required to wear a face mask. So it's very difficult to sort of frame the argument in that way and not see it as just another version of Islamophobia. It was very much, to justify the sort of ban, it was comments were made such as, they're not suitable for our society. I think, when you're a young person growing up in 2021, we have a massive value for diversity, and diversity should be valued and celebrated, whereas the burqa and many other face coverings, and I don't mean to just simplify it by saying burqa, they've been politicized entirely, and it's almost cultural insecurities that have caused this total prejudice against religious freedom rooted in ignorance, just not knowing and caring enough to learn more about other religions. It's just an attempt again to marginalize that community, and justifications such as clamping down on terrorism and extremism, they're just infuriating and very, very inaccurate statements to make. And one thing that I particularly noted through my research for my article was often it was non-Muslim government officials in countries where Muslims were a minority dictating to Muslim women how to dress appropriately. And it was always under like a guise of freedom and dignity, which, you know, if that sort of laws and comments are being made by non-Muslims to Muslim people, like I just think that that immediately signifies a problem. Is it really like to protect women, you know, or actually is it a state that's just refusing to incorporate visible Muslims into their society? Because there's many other religions that, you know, you can very much be practicing that religion, but you wouldn't know if you passed on the street. So they had taken a real issue with sort of a visible demonstration of your religion. So my article sort of concluded, you know, that it's not really providing Muslim women with freedom, it's just outright Islamophobia. And it's also a worrying trend, you know, so Switzerland, that was when I wrote my article, but, you know, this is happening in other countries as well. So I spoke about France and Sri Lanka, I think, in my article. So yeah, it's just a really worrying trend. And unfortunately, it's totally like people just insecure about embracing diversity, which is a real shame.
Yeah.
To jump onto what Leah said there, I think she used a very good word, which was insecurity. When I was covering the Uyghur Tribunal in June, some of the testimony was given on the second day was from a panel of experts who looked at Chinese government documents in the suppression of the Uyghurs. And the terminology that was used to describe Uyghurs and Islam was virus, parasite, rats, infiltration, contagion. And you got the sense that it was definitely the view of the authorities there that allowing religious freedom would destabilize their control of the region. And they were insecure, and that's why they needed to engage in these very, very repressive measures to keep them under control. And there was one disturbing document from the Education Bureau of the region, which said, which was praising boarding schools for taking children away from their parents and praising them for blocking the religious atmosphere of the family. That was why they were praising them. And again, I think that speaks to Leah's point that it's insecurity that leads to the repression of religion. It's the inability to allow religious expression freely that prompts a lot of this repression.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh no, sorry. I just want to say something real quick. Yeah, and I think, you know, it's wrong. You know, these are the leaders of our country. How can they be using one's human right guaranteed under law, like whether it be domestic or certainly international law, as almost a political tool? It doesn't make sense, and it can't go unchecked, really. And I just had a question, you know, how do you think the media sort of plays a role in as well, you know, amplifying that, the government's mission almost, positively, negatively? They get it right sometimes.
I think it's incredibly important. I mean, the fact that, for example, what I was writing about, that the media campaign was allowed to be portrayed as like a burqa ban with Muslim women wearing a burqa on the photo. Like the media is the one that spread that, you know, that there should have just been an absolute like, no, we are not covering this. We are not, this is a disgrace. But it was very much put out there, and all the justifications were used as to why that was allowed to be. And really, if you disagree with something as a media professional, I think you have a responsibility to decide that that's not something that you want to put out into the world. And oftentimes that's just not the case with what happens. So I think the media has a massive, massive role to play in sort of both challenging and providing a level of accountability that is just not there for a lot of government officials.
I think this is a good segue. So the inspiration for my article stemmed from a more personal place, in terms of I grew up as a Muslim woman in the West. And I think it is near impossible to have a conversation about religion and human rights without mentioning 9/11 and the role it played in the securitization of borders, in the shaping of the narrative that Muslims never volunteered into, but has been inflicted upon us, whether or not we portray ourselves as Muslims in the public sphere. And so the insecurity that Leah and Sam have been discussing, I think on the sort of policy or institutional level, is the perfect segue into a discussion about shame. That is then internalized by the target political or religious or spiritual group. So I'm sure I can speak for a lot of Muslims, grew up with this sort of internalized shame. And so I grew up with a misconception of what the religion actually meant. And so I think it serves, this is sort of what Sam was speaking about, but I think it sort of serves to sever the link that many people feel to their religious group, because it's so embarrassing and you're sort of bombarded with these headlines and these narratives for years on years on years. And so you think, there must be some truth to them. But the angle I sort of took with this article is, by way of all these policies and this genocide and this sort of war on religion or certain religious groups, I feel like much of that responsibility and the resulting burden lands on the shoulders of women. And they are sort of commonly accepted as the scapegoats. And I can't remember a time when Muslim women were not the sort of face of, or the chosen face of, extremism or oppression. They're either the villain or the victim, and never sort of handed the microphone and asked for their narrative. But what sort of sparked this research or this angle I took was discussions with women from different backgrounds. And I'd realized that the spiritual abuse that is sort of covered in the news that women experience in Muslim communities around the world actually is experienced by women of many different creeds and colors in exactly the same way. And yet Muslim women are ironically used as this sort of, sorry, my connection. Can you still hear me? Is there a lag?
Yeah, we can. Yeah.
Okay, so ironically, Muslim women are used as almost a veil to cover up the abuse and the difficulties and the dichotomy that many other women are facing across the globe. And I think that it's a cheap excuse and a cover-up. And yet again, as we see in many, many different spheres and fields, I think that it would be worth asking women what their experiences are without shaming them in order to shape relevant solutions. And it can't be that such an intricate yet extremely common and widespread form of exploitation that is being veiled by both the religious communities, so they need to take some credit for it, but also the media and the observers is sort of going almost entirely unaddressed. So that was the angle I took with my article.
I think to jump in there, because Yumna has brought up 9/11, I think that's a very important thing to consider. It's the media's role. After 9/11 and the narratives in Western media about the need to securitize and protect against radical religion, those narratives were then used and taken by the Chinese government to justify their own repressive activities in Xinjiang. So we allow that language to be used, and then it is taken by other regimes with more nefarious intentions. And the other thing to add as well about the media, I think this was going to Leah's point about, sometimes the media amplifies one thing and doesn't amplify another thing. The Xinjiang crisis has been going on for about 10, 20 years, but American and Western media has only shifted its attention to look at it in the last 2 to 3 years. part of the geopolitics of the West and China being confronting each other. So there's not, the media isn't pure in its motives of looking at these human rights abuses. And you can contrast that with, there's another genocide that's been going on for about 46 years. The Hmong people who live on the borders of Laos and Vietnam, mostly Christian, but a lot of them are animists as well. They've been suffering a brutal genocide under the Laotian and Vietnamese, but you never hear about that in the media because it's not geopolitically, doesn't fall into a geopolitical struggle that needs attention. So the media is part to do with our ignorance of one issue and our hypersensitivity to another issue. And the burqa ban there's so much obsession about that issue. When really what is the danger of a woman wearing particular religious clothing versus the attention that should be given to mass murder elsewhere in the world?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Sam. I think it's already really apparent that although politicians and governments do have a duty, obviously, to protect and secure people's human rights, especially in religion, the media sector, journalism, also have, actions and responsibility, which I'm sure they know, but perhaps this is a good time to whoever's watching just to be reminded of it, or for those starting up in the career to take these sort of points on board so that, other reports of other stories in years to come has more integrity and is more balanced in their report. Yumna, we talked quite a bit about your article, so I'm going to jump to yours. Can you explain a bit more about the spiritual abuse? Like, I'm not sure, what that really means, or
Sure. So, in a nutshell, spiritual abuse is when, on a more intimate level, so either partner to partner or parent to child, or even sort of religious representative to congregation level, one acts as a mouthpiece for God, but actually their intention is more abusive or manipulative. And the essence of it is control. And it shares characteristics of sort of domestic violence or psychological abuse, but given the intimacy of one's relationship with God or a higher power or a way of life, it sort of seeps into I would argue, an even more internalized level. And because of the authority of the figure who often inflicts it, the level of shame that is internalized and manifests is different, because you view this person as an authority figure, and often they have power over other individuals you respect. So for instance, your parents or your friends or your family. And so you can't turn to them, nor would you even think to in many instances, because you think that this is the word of God or whatever other power. And on a sort of policy level or in tackling it, it's often grouped with domestic violence. And I take issue with that for a number of reasons. And the solution is often to encourage the individual to break away from the sect or their community, because there's a sort of you or them narrative. And the reason why I take issue with that is because I don't think it should be that an individual has the right to strip another individual of their faith, and leave them faithless but empowered, as opposed to faithful and abused. And after taking a deeper look, I found that something called religious trauma syndrome actually exists. And so the effects of spiritual abuse are multifaceted, from the physical impacts to the spiritual impacts to the economical impacts. And most of the treatments also take this view of sort of breaking away from the source of abuse. And rarely are the victims compensated. You sort of just break away from the church or the temple or the mosque, and that's it. You have to build a new life elsewhere. What if you're not equipped with the skills for, starting a livelihood from scratch, so on and so forth. And And if you look up spiritual abuse, so if you look up domestic violence online, there are sort of step-by-step processes for recovering and escaping. And there's always a legal solution at the end, be it a sort of helpline or the name of a solicitor's office, something on a global scale. But if you look up spiritual abuse and how to escape, there are just sort of instructions defining what it is and how you could potentially be experiencing it, and the fact that you could be experiencing it alongside domestic violence or physical abuse. But there's no sort of step-by-step process for where to go and what sort of legal rights you have. And that was sort of what spurred my interest, because it's definitely a thing. Many people are in agreement that it's a thing. Many religious heads have taken sort of initiatives against it, especially when the pandemic was at its peak. Hashtags were sort of established, and, religious leaders were saying, it does manifest itself and you are more at risk if you're at home. Try and think outside of the box, take refuge in your religious community. But there was no legal reprieve. And so that's what caused my curiosity.
Great, thank you. Yeah, it's certainly something that I've never come across before as, I guess, a concept. And I guess I'm just wondering, do you think this has been around for a long time, but not a lot of light's been shone on it, or do you think it's more of a newer concept?
No, I absolutely think that it's been around for ages. I keep circling back to women, but the reason why I spoke about it in terms of women is because in the media and in sort of mainstream popular material, it's being covered with regards to children and little boys specifically. So if you think of films like Spotlight or novels like A Little Life, and it's not as difficult to process it when it comes to kids, because our automatic inclination is to think, of their vulnerability. But when it comes to women, I think it's been a long time coming. That was confirmed by the response I got to the article. I was getting responses from women from all over the world, either saying that they had experienced it themselves or they'd witnessed it themselves, but they hadn't been able to label it or cure it or address it. And I also think that blatant misogyny and the patriarchy plays a role in that women are more likely to be illiterate and therefore less able to address religious texts or scriptures directly. And so they're reliant upon word of mouth and the tutelage of others. And so they're more likely to internalize that shame if they haven't been taught to study, let alone read, because it won't be their reaction, their initial reaction to sort of look elsewhere and think, that doesn't sit right. Let me have a look at the source, or converse with others about it. So illiteracy plays a role directly, as does the lack of education and the lack of livelihood and the lack of an ability to stand on one's 2 feet. That is a sweeping generalization, and I'm fully aware of the fact that it's an immense privilege to be able to speak about this as a sort of an outsider looking in, but it's pretty widespread, and it is absolutely not isolated to any one religion or demographic. So, yeah.
I think to add to what Yumna said, another one of the vulnerabilities that women have is that in these very traditional communities, the women adopt the traditional caretaker role for the children, and the children are then weaponized to punish the mother if she dares to go outside the community. The most obvious example of that is Hasidic Jews, ultra-Orthodox Jews in New York. They have isolated communities where they separate themselves from, the wider American society. And if the mother is the one that leaves the community, the fathers will do everything, and the entire community will work together, create slush funds, legal funds, in order to make sure that the dad keeps the children. And often the courts will say, well, the child is growing up in this religious environment, they need to stay with the religious parents, i.e. the dad. And so the mother is then deprived of her religious community. Her husband will separate from her parents, and also all of her children. She's left completely isolated. And as Yumna said, she might be illiterate or not so much illiterate, but very limited in skills and qualifications, how is she able to, just sort of leap into 21st century society and hold down a job and become successful, and also deal with this emotional trauma of losing her children and all of her community? It's very difficult.
One more point I'd like to make. I think it's also worth mentioning those who grew up with a religious background, but perhaps more within the sort of fabric of a metropolitan or cosmopolitan society. And I think the internalized shame that comes with that, because if you grow up as a woman, as part of a certain religion, but not within its typical confines or communities, you are then inclined to believe what your religious superiors, quote unquote, tell you, because you think, I didn't grow up with the right mindset. I didn't grow up in the right place. They are the correct authority. And that's also a way in which the abuse can be internalized, even if a woman is equipped with the right skills.
Great, yeah, thanks, Yumna. I think that's a really interesting article, and I certainly will be looking into it a bit more, just to educate myself on, what it entails and perhaps what more we can do. Just one thing, Sam, I just wanted to pose a question about, going to court and stuff with that particular group of Jewish people in America. Do you think if the judge had known about spiritual abuse and all these the implications or the signs to look out for, do you think they would then be more rule in favor of the mother or something instead, or be a bit more compassionate?
That's a good question and a difficult one. I mean, in the context of the United States, the family principle that they're applying is status quo, that the children should be as little impacted by the dissolution of the family. So that means if they've grown up in a religious household, then the status quo is staying in a religious household. Whether the courts would take more consideration if there was this domestic abuse / spiritual abuse element, it's difficult to say, because at least the approach in the courts of England and Wales is, unless there's a threat to the child, the fact that there's domestic abuse, say, between the parents, isn't necessarily determinative of where the child should be. So I would say I don't think the courts. I'm skeptical that the courts would take that into consideration, which is wrong, really. But I think the courts have a when that's not the major issue in front of them, I think the courts take a skeptical view, because in family dissolution situations, all kinds of accusations are thrown about. And so they're not necessarily going to go and say, well, oh, this woman has alleged this type of abuse, and I'm going to take that without further inquiry. I don't know. I would throw it back to Yumna and ask what she thinks, or Leah, what they think would be, what level should the courts take into consideration those domestic abuse, if there's a spiritual element to it, when deciding how do you deal with where the child lives in that kind of situation.
Leah, do you want to have a go?
I can't claim to know very much, and I'm definitely going to read your article after this, but I would, I suppose, reiterate what Sam was saying, in the sense that I'm skeptical that the courts would. I think they should, but I'm not entirely convinced that it would be something that would be really supported and enforced. I think it's an incredibly important point to be made. I just don't think society or the courts are ready to sort of really champion that issue, but I totally believe that it should be a consideration.
So I think this circles back and seeps into a different area of human rights, which is the rights of the child. And I think courts in most jurisdictions, so the two that Sam has mentioned, the US and the England and Wales, they prioritize the best interests of the child when it comes to these sorts of cases. And the best interests of the child are sort of shaped by obviously the child's opinion, but where they will have the most stable upbringing. And by way of the fact that this runs so deep, and the woman may not be equipped to sort of provide for her child, house it, feed it, despite the abuse, I think it's definitely something that courts would take into consideration, especially if it can be proven that it's seeped down to the children and their well-being. Perhaps then the court would sort of, allocate sort of payment by the father and the community to the mother, or something, if the abuse was that stark. If not, perhaps it'd be something they take into consideration instead of allocating the time between the parents. But because of how disenfranchised women can be in these situations, I think it's likely that they would still side with the parent, with the parent who's still in the community, which is sad and not right on maybe a moral level, but in this dog-eat-dog world, it's not that surprising.
It's possible that the solution needs to be not, the solution doesn't need to be alimony or who the child stays. Perhaps there needs to be greater support in some format for if a woman, so let's say, well, any parent, if one parent is leaving these communities, and then there is a child case going on, the state, or at least some kind of authority, or maybe third, NGO, stuff like that, need to support the parent who's outside the community with more than just, once a week counseling or something like that. It needs to be a holistic approach to helping them adapt to life in outside the community. Because if they're able to adapt to life outside the community and deal with their court case and all that kind of stuff, there's more of a argument about why, well, maybe the child should go with them as opposed to staying in the stable community. It's to give that parent who's leaving the community a fighting chance. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's the approach that needs to be taken, not necessarily a change in the approach to the courts. Because I think, as Yumna said, it's what's best for the child, and stability is best for the child, notwithstanding that might be in the community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really, really interesting discussion we just had. Yeah, you're right. Perhaps it's a service that teaches the parent who leaves the skills and how to rebuild their life afterwards, and then go to court and assess the situation again. Yeah, that's really interesting. And Sam, I'm just gonna ask you to explain a bit more about your article on the Uyghur trials, which you actually attended as well in London.
Yes.
Very cool. So yeah, tell us all about it, and how it interacts with religion and human rights.
Yeah, so for those that aren't aware, the Uyghur People's Tribunal it was holding evidence in June, the first part of it. There's going to be a second evidence holding in September. It's not an official court. A People's Tribunal is where a group of people voluntarily form a panel, and they hear evidence in the same way that a normal court would hear evidence, and try and come to a conclusion of fact, particularly where other courts won't deal with it. So in this case, because China isn't a party to doesn't submit to the jurisdiction of the ICJ on genocide, it can't be brought before that court. So the Uyghur Tribunal is looking at whether, is there sufficient evidence to show that China is guilty of committing genocide against the Uyghur Muslims? And as you said, Ploy, I went and I attended the first 4 days of evidence hearing with Uyghurs, native Kazakhs, native Tajiks who had escaped Xinjiang and were telling about the camp conditions, and they were pretty horrific. There was numerous cases of rape, torture, the systematic separating out of prisoners according to their health and gender, and then the harvesting of the organs of younger males and females, the torture of imams in religiously degrading ways as well was fairly common. So pretty gruesome stuff. And I think that reminds us of why, there are two aspects to this debate, isn't it, of religion and human rights. There's here's religion and here's it violating human rights, or it's the cause of the violations of human rights. And I think mostly in Western countries, when we're thinking of religion and human rights, we're thinking of it in that way, because that's what we see a lot of, whether it's the sexual abuse scandal in the Catholic Church, or whether it's, women being trapped in, say, extremely orthodox communities and stuff like that. And so we have a negative view as religion as this thing that's damaging human rights. But when we look elsewhere around the world, we see that the exercise of religious beliefs are often the victims of some of the most violent and severe oppression that we've ever seen. In terms of what's going on with the Uyghur genocide, the numbers are staggering. I mean, we're looking at 1 to 2 million people. It's a genocide on the order of the Holocaust or the Armenian genocide, and yet we give very limited attention to it, albeit more now in recent years.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. Yeah, I mean, it's certainly something that I've only sort of looked into in the last 1 or 2 years, and it is so shocking. And I don't understand how genocides and stuff has happened before, but it's happening now and no one's talking about it. I don't get it. I suppose my question is, when you attended, what is the latest with that, and is it a finding of fact? Is it to say that it happened, or will there be repercussions for the government or anything?
So it's split into 2 sets of evidence hearings. So at the minute it's paused for recess. You can file evidence. So if anyone's watching and has seen anything or knows anything, you can file evidence via the website. More witnesses will be called then in September, and a judgment is scheduled to be released, or at least a summary judgment, in December at the end of the year. And because it's a people's tribunal, it has no binding effect on the Chinese government. The Chinese government have been invited to send witnesses, but they've so far refused. And in the state media, they've described it as a show trial and other things, and won't attend and rubbish and all that kind of stuff that you'd expect. So in terms of legal effect, there will be no legal effect as a result of it. However, the tribunal is being led by Sir Geoffrey Nice, QC, who was the lead prosecutor in the trial of Slobodan Milosevic when he was prosecuted for the crime of genocide in Yugoslavia. So it will carry a lot of persuasive influence weight, and every government who is a signatory to the Genocide Convention has an obligation to take action to stop a genocide when they become aware of it. So if we have an independent tribunal, come to the conclusion that genocide is happening, then I don't see how governments around the world who are signatories to the convention can continue to ignore it. I mean, several parliaments have already acknowledged it is a genocide, so I don't see why they're not why they're not taking China at least to the UN, or at least attempting what Gambia has done with Myanmar, which is take it to the ICJ, notwithstanding that China claims no jurisdiction, and to at least kick the ball rolling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the hope is that there'll be at least some form of action post conclusion that will give the victims at least some comfort and a way forward.
Yeah, that was definitely what I've seen. At least the comments by the Uyghur diaspora community is that this tribunal is very cathartic, because lots of them have suffered these, horrendous abuses, and in regards to the women, particularly when it's sexual abuse, there is that shame element. Hearing other Uyghur women or Kazakh women stand up and say, "This happened to me," and they're being quite strong, is cathartic for the whole community. So even if it has no legal effect, it will certainly be psychologically very beneficial to a lot of victims.
Yeah, that's great. And it's probably quite a bit of a wide question, but how can it be prevented in the future in terms of religious genocide? If you have any thoughts.
I'll throw it to Leah first, and Yumna, and then I'll go last, shall I?
Well, it's a tricky question. It's really the $1 million question, isn't it? I would say, I don't have a definite answer, but I would say there is a route, there is progress that can be made. Any progress in the right direction is progress that should be taken. I think there's really outlined ways of how this can improve. For example, the tribunal, things like this. There's many cases of genocides and things that where nothing's happened, that there's been no form of accountability. And it's a really tricky area, specifically within international law, because it's very difficult for accountability to actually happen. But I think that every avenue, such as the tribunal that Sam was talking about, should be explored. I think going back to what you mentioned earlier, Ploy, the media has a massive role to play here. I think if you asked people on the street that, we all love human rights, we study human rights, many people would not even be aware of what's happening to the Uyghur people. So I think just really promoting the message at every level, grassroots up, is a way forward, because I think most change, a lot of change happens when there's sort of a loud public outcry for it. So I think that that's definitely something that I particularly believe in is a way forward for major change. That's only one small element of it, so I'll hand it over to Sam and Yumna as well.
I'm muted. I think Leah's hit the nail on the head. I mean, there are lots of facets we can look at, right? And legally speaking, I mean, Sam's right. There are many signatories to the Genocide Convention, but tangible action is rare. But I think it's worth stating the role of social media and the fact that the pristine image that most governments seek is at the mercy of social media and public outcry, and there is power in numbers. So even if you can't sort of flip the tables, legally speaking, you definitely can flip the image and bring the truth to light. I don't even mean like scaremongering and exaggerations. I mean, it's difficult to exaggerate the horrific things that Sam has just outlined anyway, but I really think that the use of one's platform is essential. Even if your account is private, you don't know who you'll be educating and who knew nothing before you brought it to light. And I mean, that is the power and the beauty of our globalized world, despite the difficulties it may present in other arenas. So that's what I'd suggest on sort of a minor scale. Don't underestimate the power of sharing, but also fact checking first. Don't just share a carousel on Instagram or retweet a tweet without doing your research first. Personal accountability is also the key.
Yeah, I think I would join with what Leah and Yumna said. It's the small actions cumulatively that can have a big impact. So besides getting the word out there, I think we just got to, each person has just got to be more careful in all their actions. Careful in what you buy. Don't buy stuff from a regime that is using that money to do something that's suppressive. So, if you go to a store and you see something it's made in China or it's made in Vietnam, then you've got to question, is this ethical or should I get it from somewhere else? And likewise, just being careful with your own words and language. I mean, genocide has happened all across the world. There's not a single continent that hasn't seen genocide, and it's ordinary people that commit genocide at the end of the day. And it starts off with careless use of language, the way we describe people. So it might start with talking about a burqa ban or face mask covering in Switzerland. And that might seem okay because, well, then there's a need to have a neutral image in a workplace, or there's a need to everyone to be the same in our society. But then that progresses up to, well, maybe we shouldn't have so many of those people in our country. And then it becomes, now we should remove those people from our country, and now we should do violence to get rid of them. So we all need to be more careful in what we do, because genocide starts off from a very, very small stone, but it snowballs and it rolls up to something much bigger.
Great, yeah, thanks. And I think to add to that for me is education. Education is so important about anything, but particularly in, for example, reading some of these articles, or just delving into, the Uyghur People's Tribunal website, which I'm sure they have. And the more we educate ourselves, the more we understand the issue, the more we know how to spot if things aren't quite right, and the more we learn to speak up about it, and stand up for fellow people in our community. So it's been a really, really interesting discussion. So thank you everyone for joining me today. And I hope for our audience it's been helpful in unpacking why religion is a human rights issue, and what some of the current topics are at the moment. And yeah, be kind and educate yourself, and don't spread fake news, and keep up to date with Human Rights Pulse for some more religious and human rights content this month. Thanks everyone.
Thank you. Bye. Take care.
Thanks.